panel discussion is brought to you by Austin Child Guidance Center. For those of you who don't really know who we are, we're a nonprofit dedicating to providing accessible, high-quality mental health services for children and families. We have a team of various mental health professionals, and we provide individual family group therapy. We also do parent workshops and provide psychological services and assessments. I'm very pleased to be joined today by 4 panelists who come with a deep knowledge and passion and commitment to helping children and families navigate conversations about race and racism. Our first panelist is the owner of Charlotte Caples Consulting, which helps leaders develop their voice about racial equity, own their power, and hold accountable systems that impact them. Charlotte believes outcomes should not be predictable by race, and that peace, power, and prosperity are everyone's birthright. Her coaching service has helped more than 5,000 leaders begin to live authentically, feel more confident, courageous, grounded, and purposeful about their journey to transform racism. As a result of her consulting services, organizations committed to racial equity develop transformational strategic plans to eliminate racism, minimize costs for potential lawsuits, as well as create an organizational culture that is racially equitable and inclusive. Welcome, Charlotte. Our next panelist is Dr. Deanna Harris McCoy. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and associate professor, researcher, and social justice advocate. She has over 10 years of clinical experience with diverse populations and disorders in a variety of clinical settings. Her research focuses on adolescents, Black mental health, and social justice in the field of marriage and family therapy. She has delivered presentations at local, regional, national, and international conferences. Dr. Harris McCoy has been actively involved in her local and professional communities by serving on multiple boards and in various leadership positions. Welcome, Deanna. Emmett W. Hayes Jr. retired from public service in January 2014 as director of the Probation Services Division for the Travis County Juvenile Probation Department. After 38 years of public service, he is now able to expand his work to benefit communities across the United States. Tenure as Assistant Deputy Executive Director for the Texas Commission on Alcohol and Drug Abuse. One of his crowning achievements was his work in the development and implementation of the Texas Criminal Justice Treatment Initiative. In 2010, the Secretary of Health and Human Services appointed him to a 3-year term on the National Advisory Council for the Center of Substance Abuse Treatment. He has served on numerous nonprofit boards and currently serves as a board member for Neighborhood Housing Services of Austin, Epsilon Iota Foundation Board of Trustees for Austin Travis County Integral Care. Mr. Hayes, now an independent consultant, operates as LTBL Consultants that facilitates workforce development, diversity management, and juvenile justice training workshops across the United States. He is an effective and motivational communicator who is active in church, community, and civic activities. Welcome, Emmett. And finally, Chloe Pico-Jacobs, LMSW, is a therapist on the Infant Early Childhood Project here at ACGC. She began her work at ACGC as a graduate student in 2017 and joined the team as a full staff member in 2018. She received her master's degree from the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work and her undergraduate degree from Northwestern University. In addition to clinical services, Chloe leads the newsletter committee for the Trauma-Informed Care Consortium of Texas. She considers social justice and anti-racist practices to be an ongoing journey that is critical to both her professional role and her personal growth as a white person. Welcome, Chloe. Okay, so we're gonna get started. And again, just a reminder for everybody who's kind of recently joined to keep your microphone muted and to keep your video off and to have your speaker view on so that you can see the different panelists. So racism is not a new topic. What is new is that people are seeing it happen in real time right before our eyes. And as parents, we want to help our children to understand what's happening. But as such, it's our role to educate ourselves so that we can accurately communicate it to our children in developmentally appropriate ways. So I'm going to direct my first question to Charlotte. And it's kind of a bundle of questions, but the first question is, how would you explain racism, its history, and if you could begin that conversation in a way that a young child can understand what it means, where would you begin? And for some, how do you explain the struggle when kids really haven't experienced it?
Thank you, Kristen. And thank you I really appreciate you setting up the context of the conversation with some boundaries about how we're going to be with each other. And that really is the beginning of establishing genuine, authentic relationships. Imperative. Another thing that before we could even get into the conversation to ask those questions is to help people understand what racism means to them. And I'm a facilitator. And so I would simply ask everyone, and I don't even know if the chat box is hot, but we about to burn it up for ACGC, y'all. So I want you in 2 or 3 words to tell me as an adult, how do you define racism? And just put it in the chat box for me. And I don't know who's managing it, but keep an eye on it for me. I can see pop-ups. In 1 or 2 words, if you wrote your dissertation on racism, we're not looking for that. We just want 1 or 2 words. How do you define racism? Because before we can have a conversation with our children, we have to understand where we stand. Oh, so we're shy, are we? That gives me some kind of idea about how prepared we are to have a conversation with our children. Before we can do that, we have to begin a journey of defining for ourselves. And I will give you a definition. Not my definition. It is one that I use. I see unfair, painful, treating people differently because, and I'm going to tell you, as you said 600 people, Kristen, we would have 600 different definitions of racism because our country has not trained us to commonly define racism. I could ask you another question. Tell me the definition of a noun. And I believe in unison, we would all say a person, place, or thing, and they added something else since I've been out of school. If I said, please define a verb, you would say it's an action. But when I say, please define racism, we have a variety of answers. That's not unintentional. We have deliberately not been taught a common language, a common definition around racism, because if we did, then we could actually do something about it. So I'm going to share with you the definition I use in my organizing work and my consulting work, and I know several organizations, several agencies, several systems use this definition. Simply said, it is race prejudice plus power equals racism. Now I'm giving you that definition for you to do your research, because before I could truly tell you what that meant, I wrote down each and every one of them. You will have to come to agree about each word in that definition, race prejudice plus power equals racism. We would have to agree what prejudice means, and that might be the simplest word to come to. Prejudging, just looking at the word to prejudge. But when we get into what how we determine what race is and how we even define race in this, that's not common. I know Mr. Hayes actually back in the 90s educated me about the oids and the origin of race in this country and how it was developed. That's the history, that's the and learn, in addition to all of the laws and all of the intentional. When we say race is political, it's a social construct, but we also say it's a legal construct. So we have work to do to learn before we can have a conversation with our children. But hey, we are in an immediate place right now where we need to talk to our children, either to protect them or to prepare them. And as comfortable as you are, I would encourage you to use the word race, because you cannot change a problem without naming the problem. So in all of our strategic ways and politically correct ways of calling it implicit bias and unconscious bias and just all of the things that we say, we've been taught to say, rightfully so, until we are clear about what we're talking about. And I think Kristen said in her ground rules that we were going to focus on talking about race and racism.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can y'all hear me? I wanted to add to the chat, but it doesn't give me the option to actually chat with anyone. It only says private. So I don't know if that's why I'm not seeing anybody's messages, but it's not enabling me. I'm so sorry.
Yes. Thank you for that, Stephanie. I think
please stop stepping on my toes.
I didn't ask before I said do that, so I can see that all of the chats, if you type and it says privately, it's going to Shauna. And I can see them and Shauna can see them and maybe the panelists can see it. So if you put it there, we'll be able to see it and that's quite all right. So thank you for letting me know that. We have to be able to name race for what it is. We have to be able to call a thing a thing. And most of us believe our children don't know anything about race and racism. But the truth of the matter is we have research that clearly says that by age 6 months, our children can tell the difference between races and can show bias. There is a preference for people who look like their parents. There is even, I know my niece would struggle with anybody who had a beard was daddy. And if daddy shaved beard, she was afraid. So they have visual clues, even as babies, that we think that they're not conscious of. And I will tell you that even by age 2, my niece came home from daycare and said, "Mommy, I don't want to wear my hair in braids and beads anymore because they're ugly." And she had clearly gotten a message about race and racism and her place in the world by age 2. So it really does not matter how the words, other than name and race, but being able to acknowledge that they know something makes us uncomfortable, and we don't want that to happen to our children. But it is our reality because not one of us has not been socialized, has not been racialized. We all have received messages about race and racism and our place in the world based on it. So acknowledging that for ourselves is a beginning place, and it is okay to say, "I don't know. I'm uncomfortable." Go ahead, Kristen.
Quickly, I just wanted to ask, so with that said, how do parents handle awkward or impolite questions that their young children might ask?
There's no such thing. We've been socialized not to talk about race and racism. Every 3-year-old, that's my favorite age. Every 2 to 3-year-old is gonna say that thing that you just wish that they didn't say in public because it embarrassed you, because you've been trained. You've been socialized to behave a certain way. And the most damaging thing that we do to our children is to shut down their curiosity, to shut down those why questions. We might be able to deal with 1 or 2 why. "Mommy, why is the sky blue? Daddy, why is it?" We might say that a couple of times, but let them get into 5 and 6 whys and we like, "Cause I said so." That's what my folks did. And you don't talk back. But encourage that. Even if you don't have the answers, encourage them to express what's going on with them. Acknowledge that they may feel a certain way. Acknowledge that you feel a certain way. And it would be great if you could put your racial narrative on your comment. You will hear me as I talk about race and racism say, as a Black woman, as a Black person, as a dark-skinned Black woman, because there's a difference in what the world tells me being a Black woman, being a Latino woman, being an Asian woman. And I'm gonna take out woman because I don't wanna confuse you. I'm gonna say person because there's intersectionality of race and gender. We wanna always know that it is a race and conversation. And so being able to name that, being able to identify how the world perceives us, because whether you realize it or not, we've all been collectivized and categorized into a racial category and given messages about our place in the world. And the disruption of racism is about understanding and explaining that place in the world and what it affords you.
So how can parents instill anti-racist values in their kids when they may come into contact with racist views in school or in the community?
That really starts with what we call proactive messages. You can't wait until they start hearing messages in school or in the community. I promise you, I started singing to my sister's belly. I'm black and I'm proud, say it loud. And Tasia would wiggle, her belly would move, and my sister would say, stop it, stop it. If my baby comes out to be militant, it's all your fault. I needed her to have messages about pride, being proud to be a Black person. She had a doll that looked like her for every age group that they make before she was ever born. It starts well before school. You have to my dad gave me some messages that I'm not going to give you all those messages, but they were protective messages to let me know that the world was not going to treat me fairly or kindly simply because I was his daughter and he thought I was the world. So he said some things to me to prepare me, and they hurt, and I cried like a baby, because I thought I was special, and I am special, but the world doesn't always treat me that way. So protective and proactive messages have to come from you about their worth, their value, and in relationship to race before they come into contact with school systems.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. We're just gonna switch a little bit, sort of just to take a few minutes to talk about what's happening in the world around us right now. And I guess I would like to ask Emmett, how do parents convey the severity of violence that's happening against people of color right now without traumatizing them or feeling like you're taking the innocence of your child away?
Good evening, everybody. I really appreciate being able to join you as well. Thank you very much, Kristen. The challenges that we have right now, even with that question, it's sort of loaded with some things that you have to ask yet follow-up questions about to get to where the mindset is as it relates to that. But I will try and take a few pieces of that question to try and give you a message that may be helpful. But let me acknowledge what Charlotte was saying early on. You do have to educate yourself. It's going to be so difficult to have conversations with your children about something you don't know much about. And they will, I just saw one note, unfiltered children will ask you more questions than you want to ask, and eventually you may want to shut them down. So it's real good to be able to educate yourself about these things. Now, as it relates to the violence that we see today, many children have been exposed to levels of violence. So you have to have an understanding of which child you're talking about. Children see violence in all forms and fashions today. I am amazed at the amount of violence that are in video games. So to think that they're not seeing violence, that they are not being adapted to the concept of injuring and hurting somebody, may be a challenge even in your own household if you're not watching what they watch. So there's always the understanding that you have to collect. So first of all, it's going to be important to ask your child an interpretation of what they saw. So if you are talking about a specific incident or situation, you have to ask them the questions. You have to get them to speak, because unless you've had these conversations with them before and you can go back and sort of re-emphasize a conversation, then you have to start anew. So your child sit there and they see the violence being committed against somebody who doesn't necessarily look like them in terms of their color, skin tones, but it may be someone who looks like a friend of theirs. And so they become, as a result of that, very angry, concerned, or even fearful because they see somebody who looks like their friend being hurt by somebody who they think should be protecting them. So there are a lot of messages in what that child saw, and being able to separate the pieces will be so important for you to talk to them about it. You can't overload these children with too much information, so you have to really dissect it and take the pieces apart. The traumatizing pieces of violence, again, they are being indoctrinated now through video games. I don't know what games your children might be looking at, but if they are involved in some of these battle games and war games and all of that, I'm not real sure about where they may be as it relates to traumatizing them. However, it is important for you to talk to them about what they are feeling, getting to a place where they can convey to you whether they feel uncomfortable or comfortable with something they saw. That way you can really get into a conversation with them about it. Taking away their innocence, that's sort of loaded too, because there are a lot of ways you can do that, and it's not simply violence. The innocence, many times the children have been taken away when they are told to interpret things about different groups of people that are negative. So their innocence perhaps had even already been stolen. Charlotte mentioned some of those things that a child may say in the grocery store at a person and use a word that you've used, but you don't want them to use it in the grocery store to one of those people. So then you grab them, some people's reaction will be to grab the child and scold them and say, you know better than that. Well, and then if you don't close them up, they'll say, but you said it, Mom. So those are things where I'm intentional in saying that you have to educate yourselves. Put yourself in a position that you're learning more about what is happening, what they see. But first, ask the question to them. Try and get a sense of what it is they understand about what they saw. So you'll have a chance to try and give them a good explanation and something that really fit in the context of a child, depending on their age group, their understanding level.
Thanks, Emmett. One question is, so as a parent, how do we talk about law enforcement with our children without promoting racist police actions or racist institutions? I mean, right now that's, I'm sure, a very big struggle for people.
And that's where we are, connecting the dot with the violence and law enforcement. And that clearly is a big concern for a lot of people today. The history of law enforcement, and, I'm going to keep talking about educating yourselves because you got to do it. But the history of law enforcement is really rooted in the systems. And I heard somebody say it's not a systematic racism, but one of our political officials. But anyway, the system of law enforcement was really created to try and control people's possessions and property. Typically, these have been people who are well off and who can afford the law enforcement. Then as time progressed, the political affiliations with law enforcement, now to be able to enforce my will on people who I need to vote for me. Those are things that are written in various books and history that you can learn yourself. The history of police, very important. You'll realize that police really, the ability to police and the law enforcement is only about a century old in this country. And one of their primary functions as we moved into Jim Crow was to make sure that they kept Black people in line. Very intentional. Once you begin to read and get your history, you can understand their intent has been intentional all the time. A little bit before that, prior to slavery, part of their jobs were to track down, bring back, and often punish runaway slaves. So there's a history that's rooted in law enforcement and policing that's related actually to violence to Black people. So the history that you will have to learn yourself will be important to getting there. Now, it's also important as you bring this conversation to your child, they see something that's going on in the street and in the camera, it's easy for you to say, police are really there working to protect people. They are working there to keep things from being broken, things from being burned, But at the same time, they want people to have the freedom to express themselves. Well, just like in any job you have, any job that you do, just like you do here at home, sometimes you do it good, and sometimes you don't do it as good, and sometimes you don't do well at all. That happens in every job that people have. So you will see people in law enforcement who will do their job very well, some who will do it okay, and those who are absolutely terrible at what they do. Unfortunately, we see the ones who are behaving terribly in their jobs, and we don't see enough of those who are really doing a great job. So you have to understand, my son, that all police are not really bad policemen. They may be bad people. So bad people sometimes do make bad policemen. It's our job to help identify those who don't do their job very well, and then speak about them not doing their job well. Back to those who have been stripped of their power. Now, this same conversation you can actually have with your black child. All right, so that first part of that one is not so intended for a black child. Black children very often have been exposed to violence and have already been traumatized. So you're going to have different experiences in relating that to them. So their question may be, why are they always doing that to us? I am afraid of them. Well, the explanation could be very much the same thing. Some people are very good at their jobs and some people are not. Now, that's talking to a child. For you adults, it's very intentional. It's a need to understand the history of race, racism, and law enforcement. It means study to improve yourself. I'm going to give you a tool, as a matter of fact, very quickly. If you will, PBS did a broadcast several years ago. It's called The Illusion of Race. You will be able to go through about a 5 or 6 series part of The Illusion of Race. One of the things that really compelled me to use that for many, many years is just this whole discussion about genetics, realizing that every person on this planet have genes that come from Africa. Life, civilization, the beginning of civilization is Africa. So genetically, it's even demonstrated to people. You know, so somebody might be shocked at that to realize you're African too, or you have African descent, or you have African genes in you. So you have to begin that whole conversation and enlighten yourselves to bring it forward. Then in this PBS presentations, you'll be able to see the history of race and racism and how we've evolved to that point. You always have to realize that there are going to be people who are going to be detractors, them helping you to understand and get clear pictures. And that has been the purpose. Racism has been the purpose that has been very intentional to separate people. So I got another minute and I'm going to offer this quote. I perfectly well understand that in the scientific sense, there is no such thing as race. As a politician, I need an idea which enables the order which has hitherto existed on historic basis to be abolished, an entirely new order enforced and given an intellectual basis. And for this purpose, the idea of race serves me well. That's a quote by Adolf Hitler. You know, so you have to understand that race has been, and racism is weaponized. It is very intentional. So it's important for people to learn at the very beginning. I mean, very simple things, differences of people. Children learning the differences between left-handed and right-handed is a very simple way to get into conversations about difference.
Thank you so much, Emmett. That was really, really, really impactful. Moving on to the third question, we're going to move into the issue of white privilege, which is something that obviously has been talked about more and more recently. And there are many people ask questions about this, so I wanted to spend some time on this topic. And I'm going to direct this question to Chloe. And if you could help us to understand, one, how a parent can explain this concept of white privilege to their children without feeling guilt or the parent becoming emotional. And is there a way to do this while keeping their children humble and teaching them to support and defend people of color?
This is such an important, critical part of the conversation about race and racism. First, I'm going to echo what you and Charlotte and Emmett have already pointed to, which is that as adults, for white adults, they have to do the work themselves. Caregivers are typically the model for children understanding the world around them. And if there is a white adult who is uncomfortable exploring their own white privilege or acknowledging their gaps in information or things that they need to learn and unlearn, there is no way that they can expect a child to do that or to do better than they are already doing. So just like if we were trying to teach a child patience and we were expecting a young child to be patient, and then we model for them impatience and frustration all day long, they're going to notice that we're not walking the walk. So I absolutely agree with what's already been said about that adults, and white adults in particular on this topic, need to do the work for themselves, first and foremost as the foundation. Second, I know you brought up white guilt, which has been discussed, especially the past few weeks. And what I would say about guilt is that it is normal and expected. I don't think that the idea is to feel no guilt at all. We tell kids all the time at ACGC that every feeling has a purpose. There are no bad feelings. So, guilt might be telling that white adult, I could have done better before, or wow, there's a lot that I didn't know. And that's okay. We can acknowledge that guilt. The concern is that white people will get stuck in that guilt, that guilt will become immobilizing and we will become defensive when these conversations come up, or maybe we will run away from these conversations. So I don't think the idea is for white people to never feel guilt when they're talking to their children. I think the more important thing is that we don't get stuck in there, in that space. I think if a white parent were getting really emotional, really dysregulated in a conversation about white privilege to the point where it was distracting from the point, they could always pause, take a 10-minute break or maybe break for a day and let their child know, this is a really important conversation to me. I'm not closing the door on this, but I want to think about this. I want to make sure that I'm communicating clearly. So let me take a break, but we're going to continue this conversation. So similar to what we've heard before, it's not about one perfect or right conversation. This is going to be a lifelong journey for white adults as well as white children. And so it is okay if the parent truly is getting so overwhelmed that it becomes more about them than the topic of white privilege, to step away or say, I don't know, but we're going to come back to this. I think in terms of practical strategies for having these conversations with kids, again, Charlotte brought up a great point about being straightforward with language. If a white parent is having a conversation about white privilege, then say what you mean and address white privilege. Sometimes we are so uncomfortable that it's appealing to say, sometimes people weren't treated fairly in history, but that's not what we're saying, really. What we're saying is sometimes still to this day, and historically, white people have had certain privileges, and we can address what those are and get into that. So it's important to be clear with our language and intentional with our language. If we are discussing white privilege, say what you mean and talk about white privilege. It can be very confusing for kids when we kind of feign to have these conversations, but are so uncomfortable ourselves that we can't name it. So Charlotte brought that up, and I absolutely agree. That applies to white privilege, just like all of these other aspects of race and racism. I think this was something Charlotte brought up too, but for white parents, acknowledging their personal narrative, their personal history with white privilege, and being able to point out things to their children, experiences that they have had personally where they noticed their privilege, or maybe just as important, instances where they didn't notice it in the moment, but with time, with their learning and unlearning, they can then recognize what was white privilege from their lives. That is such a critical thing that a white parent can do for their child, is to say, hey, this happened, and maybe I didn't realize before, but now I am, and now I am working to change and learn and take action. That models for kids that they can make mistakes. There can be things that they don't know, and they can still grow from that. I also think using metaphor and stories, especially for younger children, can make these concepts more clear. The idea of white privilege can feel really theoretical and almost too academic for a younger child, but I think that there are examples we can give, and parents know their kids, parents know their children's interests and what will make sense to them, examples from their lives, one I've heard that I think can be useful is the idea of a game that started a long, long time ago. And maybe the child didn't start that game. Maybe their parents didn't even start it. Maybe it was from a long time ago, but the rules were written differently for white people. And the rules were written such that certain privileges were given, that they had some advantages. And so you kind of picture this board game where white people were given all of these advantages and they get to move forward while others, like Black people, were being intentionally held back. And so even though it didn't start with that child or even didn't start with their parents, those children are still benefiting. They're still farther along on that board game than other kids and adults are. So that's just one example of how you can use metaphor, but kids understand fairness really young. You know, research shows that kids as young as 3 can recognize when a system is unfair, like a game. And so appealing to that notion that they can actually apply and get a sense of can be helpful. I would also say that it's important to empower white kids to use their privilege, not just learn about white privilege. White adults should be engaging kids in recognizing their privilege throughout life, day to day. There will be countless examples, but also take it a step further. It doesn't just have to be an intellectual pursuit. Really young kids can get involved with writing letters to companies that they care about to be more inclusive. They can raise money for anti-racist organizations. They can feel that sense of community and empowerment and working to create change really young. And so I think it's important with these conversations about white privilege to remind white children that they can use that privilege, that they can work actively towards a better society and not just sit with it. And finally, I would just say that there is a real temptation that I understand personally very well to be perfect, to wait until we have read 20 books and heard the 10 perfect podcasts to have the exact right language to talk to children. And I really urge white parents not to wait for that, because it will never come. We will never have perfect expertise or the exact right information. So get started as soon as possible and acknowledge that with your child, that, you know, you're not perfect and this is going to be a lifelong conversation, and taking action as a family. And yeah, don't wait to be perfect. That day will never come.
Thank you, Chloe. Those are really helpful strategies. One of the other really popular questions that were asked was related to biracial families. How can parents support their biracial children to process feelings when one parent is treated differently than the other? Or how to address racism with a biracial child that looks white or is somehow ethnically ambiguous looking? And also just how do they explain privilege to those children who are ethnically mixed but still receive privilege because of their physical appearance? So Deanna, we would love to get your feedback on this issue.
Thank you for having me. So I think I'm gonna sound redundant, but I think it's very important. And so I think parents should then have conversations with each other about being in an interracial relationship and potentially thinking about, I remember a long time ago, one of my professors told me that racism is like the smog in the air, that we all breathe it in. And so potentially thinking about how some internalized racism may have influenced you, you all coming together as a couple. Was it about potentially wanting your children to have lighter skin? Was it potentially wanting your children potentially have darker skin or have a different type of air to them? Was it potentially thinking about, well, I don't like part of my race because I think that people treat their partners like X, Y, and Z. So then I'm going to this other race because I think I'm going to be treated better. So really thinking about what is it potentially about being in an interracial relationship. And I'm not discounting that people have wonderful talents and skills, and you could and probably was attracted to the person's knowledge and their skills and their talents and their humor. And I'm also thinking about having conversations was, has some internalized racism influenced the way that I see you, why I was attracted to you. So I think having that conversation between parents is the first step. And so if you are that parent that comes from this racially privileged background, are you standing up for your partner when you are around family, when you are around friends, when they're making comments about your partner, comments about marginalized communities? So I think that's one of the ways that you then teach children about race and racism and how it is very inappropriate by standing up for your partner in those moments, even if they're not around. So even if you're around coworkers, if you're around your family, if you're around your friends, and you hear them making these comments about people or communities that look like your partner, people, communities that look like your children, and you're still staying silent, I think that's one of the ways that children also learn that they then have to stay silent too. And so then the second part is that parents then have to understand and give children the right to claim all of their identities. Even if your child has grown up on one particular side, so they're more involved with one side of the family than the other, that they have the right to claim all of their identities. And I think it's really helpful. Dr. Maria P.P. Root wrote this Bill of Rights for people of mixed heritage. And I just want to read it because I think it's helpful for parents to read it as well, and for parents to have this conversation with their children around it. So it says that I have the right not to justify my existence in this world, not to keep the races separate within me, not to justify my ethnic legitimacy, not to be responsible for people's discomfort with my physical or ethnic ambiguity. I have the right to identify myself differently than strangers expect me to identify. I have the right to identify myself differently than how my parents identify me. I have the right to identify myself differently than my brothers and sisters. I have the right to identify myself differently in different situations. I have the right to create a vocabulary to communicate about my multiracial, multi-ethnic identity. I have the right to change my identity over my lifetime and more than once. I have the right to have loyalties, identifications with more than just one group of people, and to freely choose who I befriend and love. And so I think that's part of it's the saying that children can be whoever they want to be. They can identify with all of their races, ethnicities, and they can be that whole person. And so then parents then have to allow them to be that whole person. And I think parents then also then have to understand like this idea of colorism. And so you may have multiple children that have different shades, and letting them know that they are going to be treated differently because of their skin color. So if they are a darker shade, other people may treat them differently than their siblings of a lighter shade. But I think it's part of your job as a parent then to call that out and then tell people that you're not going to treat my children differently, to have those conversations with your child that may be lighter than saying that at sometimes you then have to speak up for your sibling because other people are going to treat you differently. And I think it's also really helpful too for parents really to think about, yes, my child may be privileged because they have a lighter skin color, but then you can also tell them, so there are other children that may not have food for dinner every night. There are other children that when we go to the playground and you climb on the jungle gym, they may not be able to do that as easy as you can because they might be in a wheelchair. So thinking about, and I think that's how we can talk about the privilege and the intersection of these multiple identities, that even though that somebody may not like you in this one area or treat you differently in this one area, that doesn't mean that you also don't have these advantages in this other area. And I think as some of our panelists talked about earlier, children, they get racism. They may not understand why people are racist, but I think that they get racism because if you go into any class at any grade level, they can tell you people don't like this person. They may not like them because they had on blue shoes today. They may not like them because they had freckles. They may not like them because of the food. So they understand discrimination. They get it. And so you can just sit there and say that, so there are people that do not like mommy. There are people that do not like daddy. There are people that may not like you because of the color of your skin. There are people that then may give you more privileges and make it easier in life because of the color of your skin. And so I think it's really helpful just to have these very honest conversations, but then parents again then have to have these honest conversations with themselves too before you even have these conversations with your children. Because if you're in an interracial relationship and you haven't had the conversation about race yet with each other and what that means, it's going to be very difficult to have that conversation with your child.
Thank you, Deanna. That was really, really helpful. And I'm sorry, I'm sending out the information about the Bill of Rights. We will post everything on our website later, but I just wanted to put that out there for everybody. Thank you for sharing that. The last most popular question that we got were, we have a lot of educators who registered. And first of all, thank you all for the amazing work that you're doing, especially during this COVID period, where a lot of parents have a lot more respect for the hard work of being a teacher through this experience. But some of the questions that some of our educators posed were, how do teachers discuss race and racism in elementary or middle school settings? And what kind of initiatives can teachers introduce to teach their students about racism, and how they can ensure that all students' cultures are represented to foster strong cultural identities in their classrooms. So I'm going to kind of open this up to any of our panelists and to sort of jump in and tackle this if you'd like.
Well, this is Charlotte, and just for a piece of that conversation, I think it's important, being the education system, that you recognize how you have any conversation sends a message about racism. So there are some things that we do that silence people, that shut down conversation before it ever starts. And the fact that you are wanting to hold a conversation with children in the school environment, how then do you ensure that when they choose to speak their truth and you are offended, that there are not repercussions to those students, just as if you were in your own work environment and having a conversation about race and racism? How truthful are you willing to be, knowing that people judge and hold things against you? So I think we have to be very strategic when we have conversations. In fact, I had a conversation with just an educator friend 40 years in just yesterday, as they are planning to have conversations about everything that's happening in the world when students get back together. The fact that it's being held in a controlled environment that we already know has racial disparities, we need to be intentional in educating ourselves before creating a lab that hurts and harms even more. But I do believe it can be done. I do believe that it takes personal work in order to navigate the conversation, but I think it also takes genuineness and honesty and having relationships, so that even when we all make mistakes about race and racism, because we've all been socialized, that it's a space where we can give grace and space for people to make errors and learn and grow.
Thank you, Charlotte. Anybody else want to comment about that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that teachers have to have a curriculum to have some of these conversations, because I work with a lot of adolescents and they already know their experience. So if you just give them the floor to have an honest conversation, that means that you can just create some rules around and say, we're going to have a conversation about race and racism today, and here are our rules for the conversation. Even if you have it at an elementary level, children can have these conversations. Part of it is that you then, just as a teacher, have to facilitate it and know that we're not going to make comments that are oppressive to other people. We're not going to potentially make very rude or intentional comments that are hurting other children. So we're not going to do that. But kids can have these conversations, because they do have them. They just may not have them around some of their teachers, but they're having them with their friends. They're having them with their other family members. So I think it's just opening up the space to have them. And then I know, so in February, we hosted a screening of the documentary Push Out, the decriminalization or the criminalization of Black girls in school. So it's about some of the racism that Black girls face in school and how when they're using their voice and being leaders, that they're seen as being aggressive, they're seen as being assertive and talking back to teachers, even if they're just asking simple questions. And so they're being expelled and suspended for schools at disproportionate rates just because they're using their voices. So I think potentially for teachers themselves, that they can watch the documentary and thinking about how are they then being prejudiced and discriminatory towards some of their students of color. And just a caveat with tangent here. I was writing a book chapter about how we can increase culturally competent services, therapeutic services for youth and their parents, and the primary care system and the school are the two places where we recognize youth and children's mental illnesses first. And students of color, they are not necessarily getting diagnosed as they should. It's going underdiagnosed because they're getting expelled and suspended from school when they're really dealing with relational or mental health illnesses. But because of the way that they look, they're not seen as people that need help. They're seen as being disruptive. They're not given the same level of comfort. They're not given the same level of care. And so again, they go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. A lot of our students of color are either giving diagnoses like conduct disorder or oppositional defiance disorder, even though they might have anxiety and depression. So the anxiety and depression is still there and not being treated because they're given these behavioral disorders. So I think that kids can still have these conversations because they have the intelligence to do so. And some of them have the words to do so. We just have to give them the space to do it.
Thank you, Deanna. We have a question from Brandy. Brandy, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. You know, I typed a question earlier. One of the question that just occurred to me now was when I was trying to have a conversation with one of our kids, she expressed that she was fearful of Black people. We have lots of Black people in our neighborhood, in our community. We have lots of Black friends personally, but I guess just strangers that she doesn't know, that she has this like natural fear. And so I was trying to talk to her a bit about bias, and I didn't know how to talk to her about that. And I didn't know if you guys had any recommendations for that or what I could read to try to know more about it.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that's challenging, again, when the kids begin to bring some things back to you and you may not know where it came from. I think you have to realize that your child's fears very often may come from someplace familiar to them. You know, you can't rule that out. The children very often don't carry the same kind of fears we do. In fact, sometimes I wish my teenagers and those younger were a little bit more afraid, but children are risk takers. You know, so it's a little contrary sometimes to them to be afraid of people, unless there have been some things that happened to put them in that situation. Now, I can tell you from my own experiences that children have been told very negative stories about Black people. They have read books that have negative connotations of Black people. They may see the news that will have negative connotations of Black people. You know, and for me, when I was growing up, goodness, I wish I had a Black Panther movie, you know, that I could have gone to see some positive images of Black people. So when your child have that fear, then it may be important. I'm not sure what you might do if you have a dog, if they have a fear of the dog, or if they have a fear of water and swimming. You know, you really work to break down the resistance, and you have to find out why. So there may be some things that are very clear cut as to why your child is responding that way. They may be too young to tell you, but you can begin to talk about it in terms of what else makes you afraid. What other people are you afraid of? Why do you think those people are scary? Anybody make you think they're scary? You know, so you begin to get into a inquiry so you can get into that child's mind. Just as we've heard, these children know a lot more And sometimes they won't say it till the button is pressed.
Thank you, Emmett. There was a question from in the chat box from Alyssa. She says, Deanna spoke to families not remaining silent when any racist remarks are made, even when not in front of a person of color. Would you speak to something I've seen a lot of lately as far as silence on social media for kids and adults? It seems there's a lot of backlash for those who aren't posting comments on social media.
I think the social media part is very tricky because there are some people that don't post a lot on social media at all. And I think the backlash is coming from people that are very vocal on social media, that are on there all day, every day, retweeting, reposting, and potentially reposting about other issues, but still maintaining their silence around this one. So I think it's not just about the not posting, it's about what are you then posting about, and there are other things that you are advocating, but then you're not necessarily advocating around potentially Black Lives Matter. So then what does it mean that you are then posting all of this stuff and all this advocacy for other groups and other potential marginalized groups or for companies or for whatever, but you're then silent around this part? And so I think that's, at least that's my opinion around why there's some silence and why there's some people that are angry around the silence. Because there are a lot of people that just don't post a lot at all and nobody's really getting angry at them. But I think it's part of the people that are really vocal, but then they're silent on this issue.
I agree with you, Deanna. That can be very tricky with social media, but I also want to add that silence is one of the agreements that has been made in this country with white people when it comes to race and racism. There is a social contract with white people that we have given you access to some things, and for you to speak ill against them threatens your relationship with that social contract. I know a colleague of mine, David Billings, has a book called Deep Denial, and he speaks even about his experience growing up as a white Baptist minister and how he knew that when he said something against racism, that the systems were going to deal with him in much the same way that they were dealing with people of color. So the silence is a manifestation of internalized racism as well, that we have been given messages, that white people have been given messages of empowerment over multi-generations that's dehumanizing to white people. And part of the work that has to be done by white people in this country to heal themselves about the dehumanizing effects or impact of racism on white people.
Thank you, Charlotte. So another question was, as a parent, how do I express to my son the power his white voice has, but keep him humble? I want him to always be this way, and he needs to speak up and defend friends of color and not over-assume his power.
Here's another huge challenge for you to learn again. Now, you know, I did mention the PBS documentary. I did talk to you about genetics, and I did say the DNA will prove that we are all mixed race people. You know, so in order to understand mixed race, go back to the beginning, really, and bring your child forward to the extent that these differences that we keep to continuously separate ourselves upon are really not differences at all. We've used this term race several times. It's a social construct. There's nothing scientific, biological about it. So when you're talking about race, it's a construct that has been set up in reality to suppress, oppress, and depress people. And that's a reality. That's what these races have done. So people can be classified sociologically, and then the boundaries are set up based on the privileges. So there are different groups of privileges. I do challenge you to talk a little bit more about the history of human beings with your child. We all came from the same place and the same source. Now, how is that going to help me today? You know, because I have one child that looks very white and another one that does not. It helps because you'll be able to recognize how the blending of races has occurred. You stand them side by side and you begin to see how much they look alike and then the colors begin to blend. You have conversations about the mix of people and not so much the dissonance of people. Okay, hands up, don't shoot.
Thank you, Emmett. Thank you, Emmett. Another question from Erica. What should I be mindful of as a person of color with privileges such as education and socioeconomic status, and even growing up where I was part of the majority? How can I best use these circumstances to help?
Well, I think that part of it is then understand and thinking about ways that we still cannot be classist or elitist in some of the work that we do. I think it's part of not thinking that you then know everything because you then have education. So still being active and listening to the people that you want to help and serve, because I think that's part of it. I think as sometimes people of color, if you get these certain levels of privileges with your education or your economic status, you think you then have to go back and become an expert in helping, and then you kind of co-opt other people's movements. And the part of it is just listening and saying, so here are the resources that I then have. How would you like me to use my resources? And I think that's part of it.
I would like us to be a little more intentional in the language that we're using, because one of the things that we do with linguistic racism to perpetuate racism is to lump things and put a label on things. So the whole idea of talking about privileges, which one? What access are you speaking to specifically? Can you name what you're getting unearned? And that's part of the work that has to be done. What does whiteness afford all of us? Because we've all been socialized into whiteness to see that white is right, and that we all have been socialized to try to strive towards the hierarchy of whiteness. So we have to be more intentional in our language if we're really going to dig deep into answering some of the questions. So did you get a home loan because of your race? Or did you not get followed in the store because you were white? I wouldn't say that you weren't racially profiled, because all of us are racially profiled. White people just are racially profiled as being good.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Another question from Joanna. I would like to ask a question about how to talk to children about race and racism when grandparents or other family dynamics make it challenging, either because they refuse to acknowledge white privilege or because they have racist views. So like 2 generations of people talking or not talking to children about race. I guess as the moderator, I'm probably not supposed to weigh in, but on this, I just want to mention one thing. You know, as parents, it's certainly in my experience, you know, one of the beautiful things about when you have children often is that all the grandparents, they want access to those babies, right? And once you become a parent, you got a lot of leverage with in-laws and your own parents, because all of them are typically trying to get at those little cute little bundles of joy, right? So what I would sort of say, and of course I want the panelists to weigh in too, but this is something I talk to a lot with clients and such, is that, you know, as such, you have the leverage to control how much access your parents or in-laws or aunts and uncles and everyone else has to your children. You have that power, and you really do need to use it. And so I'm not saying that you keep your children from them, but I'm saying you can dramatically control how much access they get to your children. You can dramatically control whether or not they get unsupervised time with your kids, meaning, you know, this grandma doesn't get to babysit overnight, or this grandma doesn't get to keep you for more than an hour or 2 alone, not because she can't keep you physically safe, but because I can't be sure what she's going to say to you or expose you to, and that's going to be unacceptable for me, right? So I would just sort of empower parents, and this is not, it's not really punitive. It might seem that way to grandparents. It's not punitive, it's protective of your child, who as soon as you become a parent, they become your priority. And as soon as you become a parent, your nuclear family becomes your partner and your children. Your parents become extended family, meaning that when it comes down to it, you kind of have to be the gatekeeper of your nuclear family, your little bundle of joy, and your partner. And you need to, you know, if you need to create walls around that to protect them, and to protect the information and what your children are exposed to. So sorry for kind of inserting myself, but I definitely wanted to mention that because so many parents feel once they have a baby that they sort of have to give them over to the grandparents to a certain degree, and that is not the case. Right? You are now the parent, right? What happens in the life of that child is up to you, and that includes grandparents may be loving, may love the baby, but if they are exposing them or to things that are not okay with you, you as the parent, it's your job and your responsibility to be the gatekeeper in terms of what information your child is exposed to. So any other panelists kind of want to?
I just have to mention this one. I'm sorry, y'all, but I had this conversation with some folks from Walla Walla, Washington. The mixed couple. The wife is white and the mother's white. Dad is black. And the son is 8 years old and he's out playing basketball a couple of days ago, and his ball went down the other end of the court where 3 white girls were playing basketball and they wouldn't throw him his ball back. He asked them a third time to give me my ball back. Can I get my ball? And one of the girls just slung it back at him and then dropped the N-bomb on it. Well, now, he turned around looking a little confused and he went to his mom, mother's the white one, and asked, what was that about? Why were they calling me that? Well, so we got deeper into this conversation, and I came to realize, first of all, mom and dad were not married. They were not married because her parents would not allow her to inherit the wealth that's in the family if they got married, or the grandfather. I won't say the parents, the grandfather's the wealthy. So they made a conscious decision to not marry, but at the same time, they have left him exposed to this world that will have those conversations. Well, his next conversation went to his grandfather. And she was afraid of what the grandfather was going to tell him. You know, and basically what he told him is what the girls had said. And that's because you have that blood running in you, and that's why they called you that. That was the sad reality of something just yesterday. These parents had not prepared their child, their mixed race child, for these possibilities. And it happened right there with grandpa. And even though grandpa will still allow, whatever reason, the money or the wealth to pass on if you don't get married. So there are challenges yet inherent in this whole conversation that we probably still don't have great answers for yet. But my reality of that one would be, well, I'd have to leave the money on the table. That's me. Now, there's another reality that some folks are looking at that wealth and say, no, I'm going to wait grandpa out. What he did, we're going to get married. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Emmett. Just as a follow-up, someone was asking, what do you do when there's a divorce? And so your former partner potentially is exposing your child to his or her parents who are communicating messages that you don't approve of. I think, you know, always when there's a separation, you know, there's a loss of control in terms of, you know, when your child is with their other parent who they're gaining access to. And so one way to mitigate that is to sort of just kind of really communicate with your child and sort of prep them and let them know, you know, when you go to grandma's house or grandpa's house, you're likely to hear these kinds of things and you're likely to hear these kinds of comments. And this is the attitude that they have. But I'm telling, you know, I just want to talk to you that, you know, they're wrong, or they have a, you know, and sort of explain to them, prep your child for what they're likely to hear, because it's true when you're divorced, if your child's other parent wants to take them to visit their grandparents, there's nothing you can do so long as there's no physical harm, there's no physical safety concerns. But it sort of just makes your job as the other parent that much more difficult, because you have to mitigate all of the negative messages that they're getting from that side of the family, and which means you're going to have to over communicate and over explain and over share and over educate them. And as they get older, hopefully, you know, they can have more say, I guess, in terms of how much access they want to have to those other folks. But that is one of the challenges of certainly of divorce, and a certain amount of control that you lose when your child is with their parent and other members of their parent's family when they're with them. But there was a question from Sarah I've been speaking to my now 6-year-old about race, racism, white privilege for as long as I can remember, and I've been very open about current events. Last weekend, he looked really sad, and I asked what was on his mind. He said, "I'm glad I'm not Black. I could get killed for no reason. It has to be so scary, and it makes me sad." This caught me off guard because I didn't know what to do with the "I'm glad I'm not Black" part. It's that exact privilege. He constantly asks how he can help and puts words to action, but that one piece of his thought is one I wasn't prepared for. The best I could muster was that he just gave an example of white privilege we've been talking about, but I would like to do a better job and bring that statement back to him.
Great.
Like, I would commend you for saying that, because I think that was the perfect way of saying it. But yes, that is one of the things that we then as individuals experience this privilege around it. And yes, and it is the sadness, it's the guilt, it's the happiness that I'm not going to die because. So all of these feelings together, and then making space for all of those feelings together. And I think if your 6-year-old wants to put some words into action, you could potentially have them write their letter to their local or state representative and mail it off. You could have them go to one of the marches. So I think that, like, from reading this, it sounds like that you did a really excellent job with it. And you could potentially say, come back up. Look, I was thinking about what you said the other day, and it really made me think about what's going on. And it's really sad that people that don't look like us, that are Black people, that are dying. And like, here are some ways that we can potentially help and do our part.
Great.
Part of doing the part to do in that too is to own, and I like the way it was stated. I really appreciated the fact that I'm glad I'm not Black. I'm glad you're not Black too, because nobody should be experiencing what Black people in the world are experiencing. The only problem with what we call privileges is that everybody doesn't have them. And so then the fight begins. How do the things that are afforded to a person because they are white, how do you fight to make those a right for everyone else and not just appreciate that they're yours alone? And that can be done in many ways.
I think that was just an absolutely wonderful statement from the young fellow, because it showed a tremendous amount of insight. Now, it doesn't look so much like it is a great amount of insight, but it is. He has analyzed actually what he saw, this group of people, and saw that they have been unfairly treated. Now, I think the next course of action could be a little bit of discussion of why it is the way it is and why it is good to be an ally. And he's already shown himself to be an ally. And there are different ways you can help. And being a participant in some of the activities would be great. You know, so you've already shown yourself. Sarah, your son has already shown himself to be a potential superhero. Keep working on it.
I just want to add to the flip side to that is we can talk about how negative Black appears to be. There's some great stuff about being Black that white people do not get because they bought into white. No one came to this country white. You became white, and there was a process of becoming white to have access that cost you some things. And so that work too, Sarah, for your son to do is about how does he regain those things that was not afforded to him that Black people do have. And I think that relates to Renee's question, which I typed in the chat about cultural appropriation. We have cultural appropriation because white people know what they're missing. So they go to take it and to own it as their own. But you've got to go back to your own heritage and get those things that give you life instead of taking from someone else's culture. And that's also part of the work that white people have to do. Racism isn't about helping Black folks out. White people have lost a hell of a lot in the racialization process as well. But we don't have that conversation. We don't talk in this country about white pathology, and we know that it exists, but we have been silenced to acknowledge it and bring it up. That's all of our work.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm mindful that we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I know that there are other folks that have questions, but I wanted to sort of give us enough time to kind of do some final thoughts, I guess. One thing I do want to say is just sort of, that didn't come up, but something that has been on my mind is that racism is not binary. It's not like you are or you aren't, right? I think that, you know, first of all, it comes in so many different forms, right? That often it's, you know, as we all have automatic thoughts about any number of things, I think implicit biases are often automatic thoughts that we often don't even realize that we have, or don't think about it until we've kind of after the fact. Also, it's in all of the systems in this country. It's, you know, I have, as an example, you know, friends who, when they were about to have a baby, you know, they debated about whether or not to name their child Miles, because they were concerned that it might sound too ethnic, and if they didn't want him to be penalized, if people were reviewing his job applications, or if he was doing an application for college, so they named him Mark, to make sure that his name would be neutral to people who could potentially review look at his resume. Years obviously in the future, so they hadn't even given birth to him yet, right? Or people who have tons of education, graduate degrees, make six figures, live in a nice neighborhood in a nice house, they'll get an alarm system for their house, but they won't have it run to the police department. It's basically kind of just sort of like a beware of dog sign without having a dog, but they won't have their alarm system attached to the police department because, hey, I live in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. There's a high likelihood that if there's a burglar and the police come, they will shoot me, thinking that I am robbing my own home, right? So we have this alarm system as a deterrent, but we don't have it set up with the police, because the risk that they will mistake me as the homeowner for the person robbing us is too high, right? These are just a couple of examples of the ways in which many Black people have to think about, and things that they consider that would never occur to the average white person or non-Black person, because why, right? I mean, this is how alarm systems work. You hook them up, something happens, you call the police and they come, right? Or the notion, you know, I mean, celebrities can name their children Apple or Rainbow or whatever, because those folks don't really need their kids to have jobs. But those of us who need their children to be employed, you know, are aware that there are certain names that are perceived as ethnic or Black that, you know, some will discount, you know, our child's resume or our mortgage application or whatever based on the names that they see, right? So when you talk about racism, it's non-binary, because those are just a few examples of biases that many people have. They don't even realize it, right? But that they impact people of color. And so I think generally there's plenty of well-meaning white people in the world who want to be allies and who want to support people of color, but there's just a lack of knowledge about the big and small ways in which racism and microaggressions and implicit bias impacts Black people of all ages every day, multiple times a day. At ACGC, we see little children who will come in and they'll talk about, you know, somebody asked to touch my hair, or they touched my hair without permission, or they, you know, some other kind of thing. And all of those are examples of microaggressions. And, you know, I'm sure that the parents of these kids, you know, would not view themselves as racist, wouldn't view their children as racist. And it's not an either or. It's really a much more complicated and deeply kind of ingrained thing in our society. And so just wanting to sort of make that point, because I think that so often people view, you know, well, I'm not a racist. I don't hate Black people on site. I don't, you know, I don't wear white hoods. I don't say mean things. I try to treat people fairly and so on and so forth. I'm not a racist, but that is not really the right way to think about it. And so I guess I'm sort of just putting that out there, hopefully as a way for people to sort of think a little bit differently about that conceptually. And I wanted to give, you know, each of our panelists like 1 minute, maybe to kind of say a few words as we kind of wrap up. Anybody can go first. Chloe, do you want to start?
Sure. I'll be brief. I just want to say that I appreciate all of our panelists and everyone who attended. This is such a learning process for myself, and I am just so proud of ACGC for engaging in this conversation about anti-racism, and I look forward to more of these events so that we can continue, because it's going to be lifelong, as we have all acknowledged. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chloe. Emmett?
I am so appreciative for this conversation. It has enlightened me, first of all, because I am just so pleased to see the number of people who are reacting and responding, especially during this time of crisis for sure. But I am hopeful that it's just not this crisis, that we will continue to engage in learning about differences and continuing to load our children up with some worthwhile stuff. A lot of us have been loaded up with a lot of the garbage, folks. Just remember this: our children are the living messages that we send to a time that we shall not see. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmett. Deanna?
I just wanted to remind parents that even though the conversation of race and racism is heavy, and you may not want to talk to your children because you don't want to take their innocence away or take their joy away, just know that there are people that are marginalized across this world that understand that oppression exists and still find joy every day. Like I remember at 3 years old realizing that racism exists, but yet I still have happiness and joy in my life. So it's not an either or, that we can know that oppression exists and still find ways of being happy and joyful in life.
Thank you. Charlotte?
Yes, I'm grateful for this opportunity and grateful that we all had a chance to be here together. I think the thing that stands out the most for me about this journey, this anti-racist journey, is for us to remember that there is no quick fix, that we have never lived in a world that was not racist. We've never seen anti-racism in its purity. We don't know what that is, but that we have to be intentional. We have to be deliberate to fight against it. And that requires us to do some self-work, some soul work, and it is life work. And our goal, each and every one of us, is to live and embody anti-racism in all of its forms.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you all for tuning in and participating. And again, we're going to do this again on July 9th, same time. And there'll be more information on our website and other places about that. This presentation has been recorded, and so will be available on our website if you would like to watch it again or review it, or if anybody who that you know was missed it and would appreciate watching it. There's also going to be a page on our website with all kinds of resources, books and podcasts, and all the information that was shared tonight will also be on our website. So please check back, probably completely updated tomorrow, but it'll all be there. I wanted to also thank everybody who made a donation. That was incredible, and your donations have already provided over 20 hours of therapy for some of our most needy clients. So obviously, if you'd like to learn more about Austin Child Guidance Center, that's something you can also do on our website. And there's downloadable information available on our website as well. And really, I just wanted to say thank you again. You know, these are difficult topics, but so necessary. I appreciate everybody's willingness to be uncomfortable for the last 90 minutes. And hopefully you learned something, or perhaps you got a question answered or just a feeling validated. And we really, really appreciate everybody's willingness to come together as a community to talk about these things. It's so important. As Austin Child Guidance Center, we want to be that resource and support in the community for all of its members. And this is a hugely important issue, and one that we will continue to talk about. So thank you guys so, so much, and have a very nice evening.